The gate closed behind her with a heavy sound, and in that moment she understood that she had nowhere to go, not with a newborn in her arms, not with a body still weak, not with a heart that had just been broken by the very people who once called her family. And yet she did not cry out loud, she only held her baby closer, pressing her cheek gently against the tiny head, as if she could protect him from the cold truth that had just unfolded, because just seconds earlier, her mother-in-law had stood at that same gate, her voice sharp and cold, her eyes full of pride and control, telling her to leave, telling her she was no longer welcome, telling her that she had brought nothing into their house and would leave with nothing. And the worst part was not the words, it was the certainty in her tone, the kind that comes from someone who believes they own everything, including people. Her husband stood nearby, silent, his eyes avoiding hers, his shoulders heavy with fear, not for her, but for himself, because standing against his mother meant losing comfort, losing status, losing the life he had always known, and so he chose silence, and in that silence, something inside her quietly broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft, final shift, like a door closing forever. She stepped outside slowly, the baby wrapped carefully in a thin blanket, the wind brushing against her face, carrying with it a feeling she had never known before, not just rejection, but erasure, as if her existence in that house had been wiped away in a single moment, and the gate shut behind her like a line drawn between two worlds, one she could never return to, and one she did not yet understand. She walked down the street without looking back, her steps careful, her breathing steady, because panic would not help her now, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the sadness and the helplessness, there was a small, quiet voice that refused to disappear, a voice that reminded her she had survived worse, even if she did not know how she would survive this. Hours passed, and the sun began to fade, and she found herself sitting on a cold bench, her baby finally asleep in her arms, and for the first time, her eyes filled with tears, not loud, not uncontrollable, just silent drops that carried the weight of everything she had endured, every word she had swallowed, every moment she had stayed quiet to keep peace in a house that was never truly hers. People passed by, some looked, some didn't, and she realized how invisible pain can be when it does not shout. She checked her phone, no messages, no calls, no one asking if she was safe, and that silence spoke louder than any insult. Night came, and with it, the cold grew stronger, and she knew she could not stay there, not with a newborn, and so she stood up again, her body aching, her mind searching for any place that might offer shelter, even for a few hours. She remembered an old contact, someone from years ago, someone who had once told her that if she ever needed help, she should not hesitate, and for a moment she hesitated anyway, because asking for help feels like admitting defeat, but then she looked at her baby, and that hesitation disappeared. She made the call, her voice soft, careful, explaining only what was necessary, and on the other end, there was no judgment, no questions, just a simple answer, come. That one word felt like a door opening in a wall she thought was solid. She arrived at a small apartment, nothing luxurious, nothing impressive, but warm, safe, and real, and as she stepped inside, she felt something she had not felt all day, a sense of being allowed to exist. The woman who opened the door welcomed her quietly, took the baby gently, and told her to sit, to rest, to breathe, and for the first time since morning, she allowed herself to close her eyes, just for a moment, trusting that she was not alone. Days passed slowly, her body recovered, her baby grew stronger, and she began to think again, not about what she had lost, but about what she still had, and that quiet voice inside her grew a little louder, reminding her that her story was not over, that this moment, as painful as it was, might not be the end, but a turning point. Back at the large house behind the iron gate, life continued as if nothing had happened. Her mother-in-law moved through the rooms with the same authority, giving orders, making decisions, speaking as if she had built everything herself, and her husband followed the same routine, going to work, returning home, avoiding the empty space that once held his wife and child, convincing himself that this was necessary, that this was easier. The business thrived, at least on the surface, meetings were held, deals were made, and no one questioned the structure, because power often hides its weaknesses behind confidence. But slowly, small cracks began to appear, documents delayed, approvals missing, decisions that required signatures that no one could provide, and at first, they ignored it, assuming it was a minor issue, something that could be fixed quickly, because they believed they were in control. Meanwhile, in that small apartment, she opened her laptop one morning, her fingers steady, her eyes focused, and she logged into a system she had not touched in months, a system that held records, ownership papers, decisions that shaped the very business that had just cast her out, and as the screen loaded, there was no anger in her expression, only clarity. She had never spoken about it, never used it as leverage, never needed to prove anything, because she believed in family, in trust, in partnership, and now that trust had been broken, she no longer felt the need to stay silent. She reviewed the files carefully, not rushing, not acting impulsively, because patience had always been her strength, and she understood that real change does not come from reaction, it comes from precision. Back at the company, confusion turned into concern, meetings grew tense, voices rose slightly, and her mother-in-law began to feel something unfamiliar, uncertainty, because control was slipping, slowly but surely, and she did not yet understand why. Days later, a formal notice arrived, official, clear, undeniable, stating ownership details, authority structures, and immediate changes that would take effect, and when her mother-in-law read it, her hands tightened, her expression froze, because for the first time, she was not the one in control. Her son read the document next, his face pale, his mind racing, finally connecting the truth he had ignored for so long, and in that moment, silence returned, but this time, it was heavy with realization. The same woman they had sent away with nothing was the legal owner of everything they believed belonged to them. There were no threats, no dramatic declarations, just clear instructions, meetings scheduled, roles redefined, and authority reassigned, all done with calm precision. She did not rush back to the house, she did not demand apologies, she simply allowed the process to unfold, step by step, because she understood that true justice does not need noise, it needs truth. When she finally entered the company building again, days later, she walked calmly, her posture steady, her presence quiet but undeniable, and people who once overlooked her now stood, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Her mother-in-law faced her across a long table, the same woman who had once stood at the gate with power in her voice, now searching for words, for control, for something to hold onto, but finding none. She spoke then, not loudly, not harshly, just clearly, stating facts, decisions, and expectations, not as revenge, but as responsibility. Her husband tried to speak, tried to explain, but she raised her hand gently, stopping him, not out of anger, but because some words come too late. The room was silent as she outlined the future of the company, the changes needed, the accountability required, and when she finished, there was no applause, no dramatic ending, just a quiet understanding that everything had changed. She did not take their home, she did not remove them completely, she simply set boundaries, fair and firm, because justice for her was not about destroying others, it was about restoring balance. Weeks passed, and the company stabilized, stronger than before, built now on clarity rather than illusion, and she continued her work, not from the big house, but from her own space, where she could raise her child in peace. Her mother-in-law became quieter, her presence less dominant, her voice less certain, because power without respect does not last. Her husband tried, in small ways, to reconnect, to be present, but trust, once broken, takes time, and she did not rush that process either. One evening, she sat by the window, her baby sleeping peacefully beside her, and she looked out at the city, her eyes calm, her heart steady, and she realized that the gate that once closed behind her had not ended her story. It had opened a different path, one where she did not need permission to exist, one where her strength could finally be seen, not as something hidden, but as something real. And in that quiet moment, she allowed herself a small smile, not because everything was perfect, but because she had endured, she had remained patient, and when the time came, she had chosen justice over revenge, and that made all the difference.